The message stayed on Emily's screen long after the conversation ended. I forgot what it felt like to be understood without having to explain everything. Daniel's words echoed in her mind with a strange kind of softness. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest in a way people rarely allowed themselves to be anymore. Outside her apartment window, the city kept moving. Cars slid through wet streets beneath glowing traffic lights. A train rattled somewhere in the distance. Wind brushed lightly against the glass, carrying the quiet sound of winter settling deeper into Chicago. Emily stood there for several seconds without moving. Then slowly, she walked toward the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were steadier now. That surprised her. A few months ago, silence had felt unbearable. Every quiet room reminded her of loss. Every evening stretched too long. Every night carried the weight of thoughts she didn't want to sit with. But now, the silence felt different. Not empty, just calm. And somehow that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Because peace meant something had changed inside her. Something permanent. She leaned lightly against the counter and closed her eyes for a moment. The memory of Daniel's hug returned unexpectedly. Brief, warm, careful. The kind of embrace that carried meaning. Precisely because it asked for nothing in return. Emily opened her eyes quickly, almost frustrated with herself. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. Not him. Not even the connection itself. But the emotional dependency quietly forming underneath it. She had spent years learning how to survive on her own. Years teaching herself not to lean too heavily on anyone. People left. Circumstances changed. Life rearranged itself without permission. Depending on someone always came with risk. And yet Daniel had stepped into her life so naturally that she never saw the shift happening until it already mattered. That was the dangerous part. Nothing about them had started intensely. There were no reckless decisions, no dramatic confessions, no whirlwind romance sweeping her off balance. It had been slower than that, steadier, built from ordinary moments. Conversations after difficult days. Coffee shops filled with background noise. Late-night messages neither of them planned to send. The kind of connection that sneaks into your life quietly enough that by the time you notice it, it already belongs there. Emily stared down at the water in her glass, then finally set it aside untouched. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Not because her mind was racing, but because it was too aware. Aware of how deeply Daniel had settled into her routines. Aware of how much she missed him even after only a few hours apart. Aware of how impossible it was becoming to pretend this connection existed in some safe emotional distance. Around 2 a.m., she finally gave up trying to sleep and walked into the living room. The apartment was dim except for the soft yellow glow of a lamp near the bookshelf. She wrapped a blanket around herself and sat on the couch. Her phone rested on the coffee table in front of her. She told herself not to pick it up, then picked it up anyway. No new messages. A strange disappointment settled in her chest before she immediately felt ridiculous for it. Emily let out a quiet breath and leaned back. When did this happen? She whispered to herself. And honestly, she didn't know. Maybe it happened the night of that first phone call when Daniel listened instead of trying to fix her. Maybe it happened during those endless conversations where she slowly stopped feeling alone. Or maybe it happened in smaller moments she never paid attention to at the time. The way he remembered tiny details. The way he noticed when her tone changed. The way he made space for silence instead of filling it with noise. She had met plenty of people before. Interesting people, kind people, attractive people. But very few people ever made her feel emotionally safe. Daniel did, and that truth was becoming harder to ignore. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Emily barely slept, but she forced herself through her normal routine anyway. Coffee, emails, a rushed shower. Work clothes carefully chosen without much thought. By the time she stepped outside her apartment building, snow had begun falling lightly across the city. Chicago looked softer under snow, quieter, as if the entire world had lowered its voice. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and started walking toward the train station. Her phone buzzed in her pocket halfway there. She already knew who it was before checking. Morning. Don't forget your presentation today. You'll do great. Daniel. Simple, casual, but the message warmed something inside her instantly. Emily smiled despite herself, then immediately looked around like someone might have noticed. The reaction felt embarrassingly automatic now. She typed back carefully. You remember too much. A reply came almost immediately. That's because you pretend small things don't matter when they actually do. Emily stopped walking for half a second after reading it, because once again, he understood her too well. At work the day moved quickly. Meetings blurred together. Phones rang constantly. People rushed through hallways carrying coffee cups and stress in equal measure. Emily normally handled busy days well. She liked structure, deadlines, predictability. But today her focus kept slipping. Tiny things reminded her of Daniel, a song playing faintly in a cafe downstairs, a joke one of her coworkers made. Even the weather somehow felt connected to him now. It annoyed her a little, mostly because she knew exactly what it meant. By late afternoon, her presentation had gone better than expected. Her manager congratulated her. Coworkers smiled. Someone suggested celebratory drinks after work. Emily almost agreed out of habit. Then her phone buzzed again. How'd it go? Just 4 words. But somehow those 4 words mattered more than all the praise she'd received that day. She answered before thinking. Better than expected. Told you. That made her smile again. And this time she didn't try to stop it. Instead of joining her coworkers, Emily found herself walking toward the small bookstore cafe Daniel liked. She hadn't told him she was coming. Honestly, she wasn't even fully aware she decided to go until she was already there. Warm air hit her face as she stepped inside. The cafe smelled like espresso, old paperbacks, and cinnamon. Soft jazz played quietly overhead. People sat scattered around the room reading or typing on laptops, and near the back window. Daniel looked up. Their eyes met instantly. The surprise on his face slowly turned into something softer, something genuine. Emily felt her heartbeat stumble slightly. He stood as she approached. "You're here," he said. It was such a simple sentence, but the way he said it made it sound like something he was quietly happy about. Emily slipped off her gloves slowly. "I was nearby," she lied. Daniel smiled immediately. Not mocking, just aware. "You're terrible at lying," he said. She laughed softly under her breath, and just like that, the tension inside her loosened again. They talked for hours that evening. About nothing important. And somehow everything important at the same time. Daniel talked about one of his professors driving everyone insane before finals. Emily told him about a coworker who accidentally emailed confidential notes to the entire office. They laughed more than usual. At one point, Daniel looked at her carefully across the table. "You seem lighter," he said quietly. Emily looked down at her coffee cup. "Do I? Yeah." She didn't answer immediately, because she knew why, and admitting it aloud felt dangerous. Finally, she said softly, "Maybe I'm just tired of carrying heavy things." Daniel watched her for a second, then nodded once, not pushing further. That was another thing about him. He knew when silence deserved respect. Outside, snow continued falling steadily. The city glowed white beneath streetlights. People passed by the cafe windows bundled in scarves and heavy coats. Time slipped again, the way it always seemed to, when they were together. Eventually, the cafe began closing. Employees stacked chairs nearby and wiped down counters. Neither of them moved right away. Neither seemed eager to end the night. Finally, Daniel stood. "I'll walk you home." Emily almost refused automatically, not because she didn't want him to, but because she was used to handling everything alone. Still, she nodded. The cold air outside hit them immediately. Snow crunched beneath their shoes as they walked side by side through quiet streets. The city felt strangely peaceful this late at night. Traffic was thinner, voices quieter. Even the wind seemed softer somehow. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, and yet the silence felt full instead of awkward, comfortable, safe. At one crosswalk, Emily glanced at Daniel briefly. Snowflakes had settled into his dark hair without him noticing. Something about the sight made her chest ache unexpectedly. Not sadness, not fear exactly, just awareness. Awareness that this mattered more than she wanted it to. "You're thinking again," Daniel said suddenly. Emily blinked. "How do you know?" "You get quieter." She looked ahead toward the glowing streetlights. "You notice too much." Daniel smiled lightly. "Occupational hazard." "What occupation?" "Caring about you." The words landed gently, but they landed hard. Emily looked at him quickly. Daniel immediately seemed to realize what he'd said. Not regretful, just honest. Neither of them spoke for several seconds afterward. Their footsteps echoed softly against the sidewalk. Emily's heart beat unevenly inside her chest. Because there it was again. That line between friendship and something deeper. And every day it became harder to pretend they weren't already standing on it together. When they reached her apartment building, they stopped near the entrance. Snow drifted quietly around them. Warm light spilled from the lobby windows onto the sidewalk. Daniel shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I had a good night," he said. Emily nodded slowly. "Me too." Neither moved, and suddenly the space between them felt smaller than it ever had before. Not physically, emotionally, dangerously so. Emily could feel it, that invisible pull drawing them closer little by little. Not rushed, not forced, just inevitable in the quietest way possible. Daniel looked at her carefully. His expression carried the same restraint she felt inside herself, as if he was standing at the edge of something important and trying not to move too fast. "You should go inside before you freeze," he said softly. Emily almost smiled. "You too." Still neither moved immediately. Then finally Daniel stepped back slightly. "Good night, Emily." "Good night, Daniel." She walked into the building without looking back at first. But halfway through the lobby, she turned. Through the glass doors, she could still see him standing there beneath falling snow. And for one brief second, their eyes met again. Then Daniel smiled faintly and walked away into the winter night. Emily stood frozen inside the lobby long after he disappeared from view, because deep down, she already knew this was no longer just friendship, and no matter how carefully they handled it, something between them had already begun. Emily barely slept after that night, not because something dramatic had happened. Nothing had. Daniel hadn't kissed her. He hadn't confessed some overwhelming declaration of love. There had been no reckless moment standing beneath the snow outside her apartment building. And somehow that made it harder, because whatever this was between them didn't feel impulsive, it felt real. That was the problem. Real things carried consequences. The next few days passed carefully. Too carefully. Emily noticed it immediately in herself. She started replying slower again. Not cold, not distant enough to hurt him, just measured, controlled. She told herself she needed space to think clearly before emotions carried them somewhere neither of them was fully prepared for. But distance didn't create clarity. It only created absence. And absence had a way of revealing what mattered most. By Thursday evening, Emily found herself staring at her phone more than working. Daniel's last message sat unanswered for nearly an hour. "Hope your meeting went well today." Simple, kind, completely undeserving of the emotional weight she attached to it. She finally typed back. "It did. Thanks." 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "Glad to hear it." Then nothing. No attempt to keep the conversation going, no pressure, and somehow his restraint made her chest hurt more. Because Daniel always seemed to understand what she needed emotionally before she understood it herself. Emily set her phone down and leaned back in her office chair. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago glowed against the dark evening sky. Snow still lined the streets in fading piles. Headlights reflected against wet pavement below like moving streams of gold. Everyone else had already gone home. The office was quiet now. Too quiet. She closed her eyes briefly, and finally admitted the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She missed him. Not casually. Not temporarily. Deeply. She missed their conversations. She missed his steadiness. She missed the feeling of being emotionally understood without needing to perform strength every second of the day. Emily had spent years building independence so carefully that she forgot human connection wasn't weakness. But Daniel reminded her, not loudly, quietly, in all the ways that mattered most. Her phone buzzed again suddenly. This time it wasn't a message. It was a call. "Daniel." Emily stared at the screen for 2 full seconds before answering. "Hey." His voice sounded softer than usual. "Tired, maybe." "Hey," she replied quietly. A small silence followed. Not awkward, just careful. Finally Daniel spoke again. "Did I do something wrong?" There it was, direct, honest. Emily closed her eyes immediately. "No." "Then why does it feel like you disappeared again?" The question wasn't angry. That made it worse, because she could hear genuine confusion underneath it. Emily looked down at her hands. "I'm trying to think clearly." Another pause. "And what does thinking clearly tell you?" Her throat tightened slightly. "That this is complicated." Daniel exhaled softly through the phone. "Complicated doesn't always mean bad." Emily rested her forehead lightly against her hand. "You say that because you haven't lived long enough to know how messy life gets." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them, not because they were cruel, but because they sounded unfair. Daniel was quiet for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. "You keep talking like I'm a temporary phase in your life." Emily's chest tightened. "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" She didn't answer immediately because the truth was difficult to say aloud. Finally she whispered, "I think I'm afraid of needing you." The silence after that felt enormous, not empty, heavy, honest. And when Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had softened completely. "Emily." She swallowed hard. "I was fine before you," she continued quietly. "Lonely sometimes, exhausted constantly, emotionally disconnected from half my own life, but functional, stable. And now?" Emily stared out at the city lights. "Now losing you would hurt." Neither of them spoke for several seconds, because there it was. The truth both of them had been carefully circling around for months. Daniel spoke first. You're not losing me. You can't promise that. No, he admitted softly. I can't. That honesty nearly broke her, because false reassurance would have been easier. But Daniel never lied to her just to make things comfortable. I just know, he continued quietly, that what we have matters to me enough not to walk away from it carelessly. Emily felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes, not dramatic tears, just emotion finally reaching the surface after being controlled for too long. Come outside, Daniel said gently. She blinked. What? I'm downstairs. Emily's heart stopped for half a second. You're what? I've been sitting in my car for 20 minutes trying to decide if I should call. A surprised laugh escaped her before she could stop it. You drove all the way here. I needed to see you. Those 6 words shattered the last emotional wall she had left. 20 minutes later, Emily stepped outside the office building, wrapped in her coat and scarf. Cold air hit her instantly. Daniel stood near the sidewalk beneath a streetlight, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city buzzed quietly around them. Cars passed, people hurried by, but the second Daniel looked at her fully, everything else seemed to blur into background noise. Emily walked toward him slowly. You shouldn't have come, she said softly. I know. Then why did you? Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because distance wasn't fixing anything, her chest tightened again. God, why was honesty from him always so disarming? They started walking without deciding where to go, just moving through cold streets, side by side beneath glowing city lights. Emily shoved her hands deeper into her coat pockets. I don't know what the right thing is here, she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded once. I know. You seem calmer about this than I am. That's because I'm not fighting what I feel anymore. She looked at him immediately. The sincerity in his expression made it impossible to look away. You really care about me, she whispered. Daniel gave a small smile. You're only realizing that now? Emily laughed softly despite herself, then her expression faded again. This could change your life. So could never experiencing it. The answer hit her harder than she expected, because deep down, she knew he was right. Life wasn't safe either way. Avoiding connection didn't protect people from pain. It only protected them from closeness. They stopped near the lake eventually. The water stretched dark beneath the night sky, reflecting distant city lights in broken patterns. Cold wind moved across the shoreline. Emily wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Daniel looked out at the water quietly before speaking again. I'm not asking for forever right now. Emily turned toward him slightly. I'm not asking for promises or guarantees or some perfect future we can't predict. Then what are you asking for? Daniel looked at her fully. A chance not to walk away from something meaningful just because it scares us. The word settled deeply inside her, because fear had been controlling her decisions for longer than she wanted to admit. Fear of regret, fear of judgment, fear of emotional dependence, fear of losing something important after finally finding it. But standing here now, looking at Daniel beneath the cold winter lights, Emily realized something quietly devastating. She was already emotionally attached. Walking away wouldn't protect her anymore. It would only hurt differently. Daniel stepped slightly closer, not enough to pressure her, just enough for warmth to exist between them. You once told me some people enter our lives exactly when we need them, he said softly. Emily's breath caught. She remembered saying that, months ago, back when neither of them fully understood what was happening between them. Daniel held her gaze carefully. I think maybe we needed each other. The honesty in his voice broke something open inside her completely. Emily looked down briefly. Overwhelmed by emotion she could no longer organize into neat categories, and for the first time in years, she stopped trying. When she looked back up again, her eyes were shining slightly. I don't know how this ends, she admitted. Daniel nodded gently. Neither do I. The wind moved softly around them. City lights flickered across the lake, and somewhere between fear and honesty, Emily made a choice, not a dramatic one, not reckless, just real. Slowly she stepped closer to him. Daniel's expression softened instantly. Neither of them rushed the moment. Neither tried to turn it into something cinematic. It was quieter than that, more meaningful. Emily rested her forehead lightly against his shoulder first, almost testing whether this was real. Daniel exhaled shakily beside her, then his arms wrapped around her carefully, like she was something important, something worth being gentle with. Emily closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she stopped feeling like she had to hold herself together alone. Weeks passed after that night. Not perfectly, not magically. Real life still existed around them. Work stress, questions from friends, Moments of uncertainty neither of them fully knew how to answer. But they faced those things honestly now instead of hiding from them. And strangely, that honesty made everything feel steadier. Emily learned that love didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly through consistency, through emotional safety, through someone remembering how you take your coffee, or noticing when your silence means exhaustion instead of anger. Daniel learned that maturity wasn't about age alone. It was about presence, patience, choosing someone carefully instead of impulsively. They still moved slowly, still respected the reality of their differences. But they stopped treating their connection like something dangerous that needed to be escaped. Instead, they treated it like something valuable that deserved care. Spring arrived gradually across Chicago. Snow melted, trees slowly regained color. The lake no longer looked cold and distant beneath gray skies. One evening, months later, Emily stood once again by her apartment window, watching city lights flicker awake below. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Daniel stood beside her holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her quietly. Emily smiled before accepting it. "You know," she said softly, "everything changed because of one phone call." Daniel leaned lightly against the window beside her. "The bad one?" Emily looked up at him, then slowly shook her head. "No," she whispered, "the one after it." Daniel smiled gently, and this time, Emily didn't feel afraid of what came next. Because some people enter your life to teach you loss. But others arrive to remind you that your heart is still capable of being seen, understood, and loved exactly as it is. And sometimes, the most unexpected connections become the ones that finally feel like home.